Good day, folks. Today is May 22nd, 2025, and I'm coming to you from the hills outside of Kalamata, Greece, with my latest rant of the week. And the subject of my rant this week is going to be elites covering their asses. It all began, in a manner of speaking, on Monday of this week, when the Canadian, French, and UK governments put out a statement that was, by my reckoning, unprecedented, because it explicitly threatened sanctions against Israel for the very first time in my lifetime. I've never seen such a statement before. It also threatened concrete actions, in addition to using the phrase targeted sanctions. And these phrases were employed in the context of Israel's deprivation of humanitarian aid to the civilian population of Gaza and the expanded slaughter by the Israeli military, its ground forces in Gaza. And it was also used, the phrase targeted sanctions in particular, was used in connection with Israel's relentless settlement expansion. On the same day, about 28 states, the overwhelming majority of which were European, but also Canada, Japan, and I think perhaps one or two other states outside of the Union, stated without any explicit threats that they demanded that Israel resume the provision of humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza in sufficient quantities to sustain them, and that it allow the traditional mechanisms for the delivery of that aid to be employed, rather than some, American mercenaries masquerading as humanitarian workers. And shortly after that, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, David Lammy, whom George Galloway has frequently likened to former Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, and I think with complete justification, frankly, stood up in the British Parliament and gave a thundering speech of righteous indignation about Israel's conduct in the Gaza Strip. Here's some of what Lammy had to say.
This weekend, the Israeli Defense Force started a new extensive ground operation throughout Gaza, Operation Gideon's Chariot. 5 Israeli divisions are now operating there. Prime Minister Netanyahu says that they're going to take control of the Strip, letting only minimal amounts of food reach Gazans. Madam Deputy Speaker, I quote Mr. Netanyahu. He says, just enough to prevent hunger. Fewer than 10 trucks entered Gaza yesterday. The UN and the World Health Organization have issued stark warnings of the threat of starvation hanging over hundreds of thousands of civilians. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are now entering a dark new phase in this conflict. Netanyahu's government is planning to drive Gazans from their homes into a corner of the Strip to the south and permit them a fraction of the aid that they need. Yesterday, Minister Smodrick even spoke of Israeli forces cleansing Gaza. As the Prime Minister and fellow leaders said yesterday, we cannot stand by in the face of this new deterioration. It is incompatible with the principles that underpin our bilateral relationship, rejected by members across this House, and frankly, it's an affront to the values of the British people. Therefore, today, I'm announcing that we have suspended negotiations with this Israeli government on a new free trade agreement.
Now, I have a few comments about Lammy's speech of righteous indignation. First of all, if Lammy is vying for an Academy Award for Best Acting, I think as bad as acting is in Hollywood nowadays, he's a long shot, to put it mildly. I mean, that was not even the equivalent of a C-grade acting performance. He's talking about the war having entered a dark new phase. Where has this man been over the past 19 months? This war has been firmly ensconced in a dark new phase from the very beginning, when the Israelis said in October 2023 that the people of Gaza were human animals and that they were going to deprive them of all humanitarian aid. And that the defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, who has now been indicted, many months ago actually, was indicted by the ICC, he said that he was going to protect Israeli soldiers from prosecution. And the prime minister was out there in October of 2023 invoking the biblical story of Amalek and clearly signaling to Israel's troops that he wanted them to treat the civilian population of Gaza as the enemy and as legitimate targets for their murderous rampage. Dark new phase? When has this not been a dark new phase? Foreign Secretary Lammy. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this acting performance, this D-grade acting performance in the British Parliament, is that even as Lammy was telling us about this dark new phase, the British government continued to supply weapons to Israel and also continued through its Akrotiri military base on the southern coast of Cyprus to conduct spy flights over Gaza. For what purpose was it doing that, if not for the purpose of aiding the Israelis with whatever intelligence it had gathered through those spy flights? Back in September, when this Labour government came to power, with great fanfare, they suspended about 30 licenses for the export of military goods to Israel. The only problem is that constituted less than 10% of the 350 export licenses that were then extant. And at the time, the Starmer government made a big to-do about the fact that the UK actually accounted for a very small proportion of the weapons being imported by Israel, the vast majority of them coming from the United States and the neo-Nazi German regime. That's precisely what it's become, frankly. That's true. Okay, I'm not going to contest that, relatively speaking, the British provide a very small proportion of Israel's weapons from their own facilities in the UK. But Starmer and Lammy have been ignoring the fact that they've been using the Akrotiri military base in the south of Cyprus, something that I've documented again and again by going there myself and witnessing these huge military transport planes taking off over and over again in the direction of Israel. They're using that base to funnel American weapons and German weapons, perhaps, weapons from all around the world, for all we know, in massive quantities to the genocidal regime. And they've been doing it from the very beginning, and they continue to do it to this very day. There's no indication that any of that has stopped. So this righteous indignation that Lammy purports to feel is completely fabricated. And in fact, if Lammy were to hold Israel accountable, if the Starmer government were to do that, truly accountable for its genocide, they would in effect be incriminating themselves, because they've been providing weaponry, both their own weaponry and US and perhaps German and other weaponry to Israel throughout the genocide, and been providing intelligence to the Israelis, and been allowing UK citizens to serve in the Israeli military without prosecuting them for complicity in war crimes. And I could go on and on. This was all just theater, folks. And the big bad announcement of the Foreign Secretary in this acting performance in the British Parliament was that the Starmer government was going to suspend trade talks with Israel. That's supposed to be a penalty? Are you kidding me? Suspending trade talks with Israel doesn't necessarily mean that the trade talks aren't going to resume one day, perhaps in the near future. Doesn't necessarily mean that the trade talks aren't going to end up resulting in a deepened trade relationship between Israel and the United Kingdom. And suspending trade talks doesn't involve depriving Israel of benefits it is already receiving under trade agreements with the United Kingdom. Again, this is pure theater. It will have absolutely no impact whatsoever on the attitude of the genocidal entity towards the civilian population of Gaza or any other aspect of its obligations under international law. Now, at the same time, as Lammy was putting on this performance, of course, the Canadians and the French were threatening sanctions against Israel. That was on Monday. On Tuesday, Tom Fletcher, the head of humanitarian relief at the United Nations, told the press that if the provision of aid did not enter Gaza immediately and in substantial quantities, that there were 14,000 Palestinian babies that were at risk of starvation. He said this on Tuesday, and it has been very clear from the very beginning. The United Nations has said this repeatedly, as have other humanitarian experts, that Gaza required, prior to the commencement of the genocide, a minimum of 500 aid trucks per day, somewhere in the range of 500 to 600, given the absolutely desperate condition of the people in Gaza and the civilian infrastructure and the fact that they're on the verge of mass starvation. That number surely must be higher. The necessary number of aid trucks must be far in excess at this stage of 500, but let's use 500 just for purposes of illustration. How many aid trucks went into the devastated Gaza Strip today? 92. 92 went in, 2 of which were stolen. So here we are. We're now 2 days beyond the warning of Tom Fletcher, the UN head for humanitarian relief, that up to 14,000 Palestinian babies would die within 48 hours. That's today, 48 hours. And only 92 aid trucks went in, a fraction of what's actually required. And has the Canadian government, the British government, or the French government imposed any sanctions at all on Israel? Zero, my friends. Zero sanctions. They just announced the 17th round of sanctions on the Russian Federation. Now, according to the United Nations, Russian forces and Ukrainian forces together have killed approximately 12,500 civilians we're now approaching 3.5 years of large-scale, brutal warfare. What proportion of those civilians were killed by Russian forces and what proportion were killed by Ukrainian forces? It's very unclear. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say that all of those civilians were killed by Russian forces in approximately 3.5 years. Well, the number of children alone, just children, I'm talking about other civilians, male civilians, adult males, adult female civilians, elderly, and so forth, people who are non-military age in Gaza. The number of children that Israel has massacred in about half the time is at least 17,400, at least 17,400. And of course, that doesn't include the children who have been trapped under the rubble, probably thousands of those, nor does it include the unknowable number, at least unknowable at this stage, of the children who have died indirectly as a result of Israel's genocidal rampage in Gaza. For example, they've died of starvation, they've died of disease, or some other avoidable cause resulting from the destruction of Gaza. And yet we have not seen a single sanction applied by the European Union on any military or civilian leader in Israel, nor have we seen any meaningful sanctions whatsoever applied by the European Union to corporations that are participating in and profiting from Israel's genocidal rampage in Gaza. And this brings me to an incident that occurred this week in the West Bank. Well, it turns out that Israel doesn't want any foreign diplomats surveying the carnage that is inflicted upon the people of the Jenin refugee camp. Yesterday, I believe it was, diplomats from 25 countries, including European countries, and Canada, were in the camp of Jenin when they were suddenly fired upon by soldiers from Israel's genocide forces, causing them to scurry for cover. The Israeli military explained this latest travesty by saying that there had been an approved path that those diplomats were to take, but that they deviated from the path. Let me point out, first of all, that the International Court of Justice ruled last year that Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is illegal and must end immediately. Israel has taken absolutely no steps to bring the occupation of either the West Bank or Gaza to an end. And in fact, if anything, they've entrenched the occupation even further and used it to inflict even greater suffering upon the occupied Palestinians. So the forces that were in the West Bank at the time dictating where these diplomats could and could not go were there illegally. They had no right to dictate anything whatsoever to foreign diplomats in the West Bank and there at the invitation of the Palestinian Authority. Not only that, but let's suppose that they had the authority to dictate where they would go. These diplomats didn't pose any kind of a threat to Israel in terms of military activity. They were not armed. They were there simply to bear witness what was happening. So even if they deviated from some path that had been dictated by Israel's genocidal military, why would that justify Israeli soldiers firing upon them with warning shots? What possible harm were they going to do? All they were going to do was bear witness to Israel's atrocities, which is precisely why the Israeli military decided to terrify them. Now, what was the reaction of the Canadian and European governments to this outrage? Let's have a listen to the top foreign diplomat from the European Union, Kaja Kallas, in explaining the response of the Union to this travesty.
We definitely call on Israel to investigate this incident and also hold these accountable who are responsible for this, and any threats on diplomats' lives are unacceptable.
Now, in a similar vein, the new Canadian Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, issued a statement yesterday in which she said that they were going to summon the Israeli ambassador to express their serious concerns about the fact that Canadian diplomats had been fired upon. And then the Prime Minister himself, Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, aka Mark J. Carney, took to social media to say that this was what Israel had done in the West Bank was totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. I've given this some thought. This language that we're hearing, the phrase unacceptable or totally unacceptable employed by the top diplomats in Europe and Canada, and even the Prime Minister, the phrase serious concerns. And I got to tell you, folks, I can't think of language that is less harsh to describe an outrage like this, a violation like this of international law, and particularly the laws pertaining to diplomats. I can think of lots of words that are harsher. You could say appalling, outrageous, horrific, terroristic. I could go on and on. I could think of many terms which would be entirely appropriate to describe what Israel did in the West Bank to those diplomats at a time in particular when it's committing genocide, but I'm really having trouble thinking of anything that's less harsh. I mean, this is like the mouse that roared. Totally unacceptable. You expect us to believe that you can't use language any harsher than that to describe this latest outrage by Israel, that you're going to carry out your threat to impose sanctions upon the genocidal entity for its genocide in Gaza? No, folks. You know what this is all about? All this language, all of these meek threats, all of these empty phrases, this rhetoric, this is about covering your ass. And it's not just the politicians who are covering their ass. The corporate media are also covering their ass, at least in some parts of the West. I haven't yet seen this in Canada, which really is a testimony to the depth of the Canadian media's depravity. But in the UK, at least, they've begun in the corporate media to put on a show of indignation at Israel's heinous crimes. So there was an editorial by the Financial Times, extremely pro-Israel, has been for many years, expressing the notion that it's shameful the silence in the West. Well, I don't know what silence they're talking about. Many people of conscience have been out there shouting to the rafters that Israel's committing genocide and that something has to be done about it. The people who have remained silent are the corporate media and the political elites. So, in effect, the Financial Times was condemning itself, although that's certainly not what it was purporting to do. And then you had similar editorials and articles coming out of The Economist and The Independent, and even Sky News, which is fanatically Zionist, was starting to use strident language in its coverage of Israel's genocide. Well, what is this all about? The grounds for employing this kind of language and these denunciations in the corporate media have existed for over 18 months. Why are they doing this now? Well, in a recent conversation with geopolitical analyst Laith Marouf, which we published this week, Laith explained that what they're doing basically, and I'm paraphrasing, you can watch the interview, and I frankly found this explanation to be rather persuasive. What they're doing is they're creating a record at the 11th hour when it's effectively too late to save the people of Gaza. At least that was Laith's view. There he and I part company, but we certainly agree that we are in the final stages of Israel's genocidal rampage. And they're effectively creating a record, these media organizations, which will allow them to say one day, you know, here's proof that we denounced and tried to stop the genocide before it was actually consummated. They waited until now to put out these articles because they want the genocide to be consummated, but they don't want to be deprived of the opportunity to defend their depravity when it becomes mainstream, as it inevitably will, to say and accept and argue that Israel has committed genocide before the eyes of the world. This is all about covering your ass, and that's precisely what Western governments are doing as well. And the most important message I think I have to share with you today in this, my latest rant of the week, is that we must not allow ourselves to be deceived by these CYA exercises in which the degenerate Western corporate media and the sick bastards who occupy the halls of power in the West are now engaging. We can't allow ourselves to be deceived. We have to escalate the pressure, and we can escalate the pressure. It is not enough for us to simply go out and protest in a polite manner in the streets with the cooperation, to the extent we can get any, from local law enforcement authorities. We have to actually do two things at a bare minimum. We have to disrupt meaningfully and repeatedly the operations of governments and corporations which are engaged in fueling, complicit in the genocide in Gaza. So I'm going to give you one example about how you can do that. You go to the factory or the headquarters or the offices of some corporation or government ministry that is fueling the genocide in Gaza, and you block access to the facility with a human chain, and you do it again and again, and you keep coming back. Now, a lot of people may get arrested, and they're going to have to spend a little time in the hoosgow. Well, in my opinion, that's a small price to pay to bring to an end your government's fueling of a genocide. A very, very small price to pay, and one that's infinitesimally small compared to the sacrifice that Palestinians and other peoples in the region of West Asia have made in an effort to stop this genocide. When it comes to politicians, you have to make them feel so uncomfortable that their lives become psychologically unbearable. And that can be done. I'm not suggesting any violence here. Let me be very clear about that. But, if you show up, if there are people of conscience show up every time a Western politician who should be tried at The Hague for complicity in war crimes, but happens to remain free because the ICC is an absolute sick joke, every time they show up and make a speech in public, or just when they're walking down the street, just when they're getting out of their vehicle to go somewhere, to go into a restaurant to dine, you have to stand there, get in their face, and tell them that they are complicit in the mass murder of Palestinian children. you have to give them no peace, no quarter, no sanctuary. They must have that message shouted at them every single time they emerge from their homes. And hell, if you can find out where their residences are, park your ass outside of their homes and protest loudly, vociferously, indignantly, day and night. Give them no peace. This is the minimum that we can do for our brothers and sisters in Palestine who are dying by the hundreds every day and who are suffering unspeakable horrors every minute of every day. We have the power to force these governments to be true to their word, that they are now going to hold Israel accountable. But if you allow yourself to be deceived by this covering your ass exercise, my friends, I fear that Laith Marouf is right, and that Israel may very well end up consummating its genocidal project. For now, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from the hills outside of Kalamata, Greece, with my latest rant of the week.